Terrific. Well, I just wanted to welcome everyone to what we're calling new voices in the conversation. Many of you may remember that 2 weeks ago, we gathered and dealt with what was called the ongoing conversation. So this is an opportunity to essentially expand that conversation with an extraordinarily different approach. Welcome to all of you. In Boston, it's in the afternoon. Some of you who may be in Europe, it's a little bit later, but we are grateful that you've been able to join us. Some 2 weeks ago, we shared a conversation with Mark Skursky of Facing History, Sam, and myself, and we focused on 5 works from this body of work called Ongoing Conversation. There was an enormous joy for the 3 of us, specifically because I think we've been sort of singing and dancing together for about 4 decades. And that continues to nourish us both in friendship and I think in our sense that there is the possibility of the art and these conversations making a slight difference in the world we're living in. So today we've invited others to share their excellent winning interpretations as a starting point for further engagement and exchange. It's kind of a flyer, if you will, an idea that came along, and more than 10 people submitted really very, very special interpretations of each of a particular painting that they had chosen. Clearly, it's a tribute to each of the writers, but it's also a tribute to the richness that's embedded in the layers of each of Sam's paintings. What a joy to be together with Professor Gary Phillips, formerly of Wabash College in Wabash, Indiana, and now of Washington, North Carolina. A dear and old friend who has shared unique insights into the art of Samuel Bak in lectures and academic papers, catalogs, and books, including The Icon of Loss, Just Is, and editing the volume of numerous essays called Repairing the Irreparable. Jeanne Koles has been and is an important part of the gallery as a former gallery staff member in her youth, and now the most valued editor of all gallery publications. For this exchange, she is also the author of the fine catalog essay, which I commend to all of you to read for the ongoing conversation in the catalog, which is available as a hard copy, but also as an e-catalog if you don't have it. And then the master himself, Sam Bak, whose work always speaks for itself. So you're off the hook, Sam. You don't need to talk about the work. But whose tales and perspectives always unexpectedly expand our appreciation for each and every one of his works. The format for today is fairly simple. We'll post the image on the screen, ask Gary to introduce it, and then ask Jeanne to read the new interpretation which has been provided for each of the paintings that we're going to be discussing. The first work, essay, was slightly longer. So what we're doing is both reading from it and summarizing it. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please post any questions that you may have in the Q&A or in the chat, and Jacqueline will share them as we go along. It was not easy for Gary and I think really to go through and choose the 5, because every one of approximately more than 10 essays brought something new and refreshing to our understanding and experiencing of the work. So we're ready to go. Just as one more note, this is being recorded. It'll be available on YouTube, and all 10 of the essays will also be available with the images. Gary, please.
Great, thank you, Bernie. And so let me say just how delighted I am to be a part of the conversation. And I watched the one 2 weeks ago with great interest. It was just very rich. I hope this one will be equally so. So to follow up on what Bernie just said, a couple of comments about the submissions that I think helped set the stage for my introduction of them. First, we found them all to be rich and creative and insightful in very different ways, probing details of Sam's paintings and then making something of that directly connected to their own experience. They also reflected on the questions that Sam's art invites, questions not only about the Holocaust, but about contemporary life that we are now facing and the individual writers were experiencing. They take, thirdly, seriously the tensions, contradictions, and conundrums of Sam's art and link that to historical experience, something that Sam makes an important point about. And that they attend to the complexity of the art in a way that communicates what I describe as an artistic and ethical urgency, that is to do something positive and repairing about the world, a theme of Tikkun Olam that Sam makes so much of. And then lastly, and this is my own take on these submissions, and then this communication, this conversation that we're about to commence as part of the continuation from last time. It evokes the late John Lewis's admonition that through this and other conversations, we're not just reading Sam's work, but are part of a larger effort to redeem the soul of a nation and of a world. At least that's how I think about this conversation myself. Now to the first submission, Still Life of a Green Bird, submitted by Hannum. This is the catalog cover image that's now on the screen before you. A couple of comments about this that sets the stage then for Jeanne's reading of Anne's essay. The theme of still life, a continuing trope in Sam's visual language. We heard him talk about this last time. The genre of still life here ironically presented. Not only do you have a slice of life, but also a slice of death, and both of those together combine to help create the tension, the conundrum, so central to much of Sam's work. Notice the luscious and lavish color that seemingly belies the seriousness of the subject matter. It's at once invitational. The density of the objects on the screen asks us as viewers to make sense, to try to sort things out, to organize, to bring a kind of coherence to what is a mix and a mess. And that the contradictions and tensions, I'd finally add, are perhaps seen in the knotted rope at the center of the image. It serves perhaps as a visual metaphor of the reading experience that in some partial way reflects Sam's own experience through the Holocaust period, but indeed of all of our lives and experiences that deal with present-day injustice. So with that said, Anne's offering of a reading of these contradictions invites us to hear her words and to look at Sam's image at the same time. So to you, Jeanne.
Okay. All right. Can an observer with little or no knowledge of Jewish history or of Samuel Bak's own history have a fully satisfying encounter with any of the artist's works? Must one be familiar with the meaning of his numerous recurrent images to appreciate his art? Not at all. Those viewers can simply dive into Bak's mesmerizing world on canvas to explore his tantalizing visual gifts and seek meaning of their own. Still Life of a Green Bird reveals an overall sense of clutter, chaos, and damage, an eye full of a flea market assemblage of seemingly disparate items crowded atop broken furniture. The viewer at once wonders what the objects represent, what the relationship is among them, and why these particular items have been brought together. Do they, in fact, represent a random order of things, a world out of control? Are they fragments of memory from the artist's past? Or might they symbolize a culled group rescued from destruction, an arc of survival? Although no one image dominates this disordered scene, two birds catch the viewer's eye, bringing to mind the vast range of human notions and experiences that birds have symbolized throughout the history of civilization. Freedom, peace, renewal, mourning, joy, death, innocence are but a few that abound across cultures, religions, and fantasy lore. Here, the possible meanings are as broad as one's imagination. The larger of the two appears to be constructed of metal, a light green-blue, as if oxidized, perhaps a sign of neglect and exposure. The bird has in its beak 2 wheat-colored ribbons, which, like the wings strewn across the scene, seem wind-whipped. Not necessarily referring to olive branches of peace or Jewish ribbons of mourning, they might instead represent life-affirming nest-building or abundance and optimism against all odds. The bird has a 2-dimensional sculptured look. No melodic birdsong here, but rather a sense of discordance incompatible with nature. The second, smaller bird appears to be a patchwork construction of wood or stone, earthen in color, with detached wings that don't seem flight-worthy, grounded. More fragmented than the larger bird, this one rests securely on furniture near a pear, a fruit also rich in religious and cultural symbolism, whose meaning ranges from birth to immortality, to the fear of separation, to suffering. This pear is blue, perhaps metal, which cannot sustain life, but will endure. Another pear, more realistic in appearance, emerges out of the cracked belly of the bird, perhaps symbolizing the possibility of life breaking forth from confinement. There is room for optimism here. Looking stunned as if paralyzed in mid-flight, both birds are tethered to rusted wires that tie them to nearby objects. The birds appear to be either restrained by the wires, which are held by an unknown agent, perhaps fate, and manipulated as puppets, or supported by them, guided by God, the tenets of faith, permitting them the chance for survival. Could they have once been atop weather vanes as harbingers of changing winds, ill or life-sustaining? The birds and other objects sit atop what seems to be a damaged chest. Closed by a rusted hinge, the chest might include articles hidden for some time. The furniture itself evokes an altar of religious or other historic significance, and the clustered items, perhaps an offering. The pears, along with the dry foliage that frames the printing, remind the viewer that despite ruin and destruction, the potential for renewal exists even in the midst of despair. The dice, some appear vaguely intact while others not. Chance does play a meaningful part in life. Will the birds and other objects be salvaged or sacrificed? The darkest lessons of history will never be stilled, nor should they be, and although the ravages of human suffering will never be silenced, hope can bring wings to our souls. As has been said, life itself is optimistic. Perhaps these birds will indeed fly again.
Thank you, Jeanne, so much for that. Sam, I didn't even paint the painting, and I'm humbled by that interpretation. So is it possible for you to respond to some of the notions, ideas, interpretations presented so beautifully?
Well, I'm thinking of the title of the book of Buber, I and Thou, of the divine element that exists in the connection between the individuals that create a kind of a bridge. When I paint, it's like putting something into a bottle and throwing into the ocean and hoping that somebody will pick it up. And this is the beginning of our conversation. And I'm absolutely amazed at how all this was read, understood. I'm really, if I say that I'm speechless, it's because really I'm speechless. I'm extremely moved to have this incredible feedback to my work.
Certainly, I feel that, and I didn't, as I said before, couldn't and didn't paint it, but Sam, the richness of the interpretation certainly is different than mine. I see the stripes of the talus at the bottom of the table. I see a variety of other images that relate to the bird from Noah's Ark, the disassembled rainbow in terms of the metal attached to the upper bird. But it's so wonderful to be introduced to this. One of the things that I would just simply like to focus on is the mention of the strings above and whether or not they're suspended or being manipulated. would be really sort of a wonderful. You have a painting that I have in the gallery office of the Wizard of Oz, essentially, which is a godlike figure manipulating the two little boys from Icon of Loss. Gary, you probably remember that painting.
Yes.
Yes, yes. I have many paintings where a puppeteer is determining what is happening in the painting itself.
And I just wanted to know, have you met that puppeteer recently?
No, I hope I won't meet him because I will have so much to tell him that it will take too much time.
So Sam, I have a question. These ropes or wires that extend from the image outward beyond the frame. Do you think that when as Anne read them, that evoked a sense of a divine presence, God in this case, that speaks for you?
Absolutely, absolutely. You see, a painting has, mainly a painting of this kind, which evokes a vision, a reality that is beyond the surface of the canvas. It has a physical space, which is what you see, and it has a metaphysical space, which is what happens to the right, to the left, above and below, which is open to your own imagination and interpretation and so on. I have absolutely no answer for these things, but I very often feel that some things in my life have been determined by totally inexplicable turn of events, and they leave me with a sense of wonder. As you know well, I have defined myself publicly in many occasions. I am a God-fearing atheist, and which is a contradiction in itself. And I think, and this is how I feel about most of the things that surround me. I can see it like this, I can see it like that, I can, and my subjects usually carry in them also the possibility of very contradictory interpretations.
And so that outside force, that metaphysical force, may also be a force of evil, a force of destruction, could it not, as well as alternatively a force for good and for life?
Oh yeah, I think that evil cannot be separated for good, because we know what evil is, because we have a notion of what good is. And I remain with all these open questions, which are not something very fresh of today, but have I think occupied humanity since it started to think.
Indeed.
And we have had a couple of questions that have come in, if you'd like me to ask them out loud.
Sure.
The first one is from Anne, and she asks, is there the impression of third bird whose eyes is in the body of the big bird upside down?
Sam, for you.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe.
Yep.
Yes, I must say, I refer always to the famous saying of Leonardo, look at a stain in the wall and you will see in it so many things. So my paintings contain always something of those stains. I mean, there are some things that happen in them that I did not. Anyway, I do not create puzzles that have to be then solved in the way of painting my paintings. I'm just wondering about the world, about reality, about the things that surround us, the things that we have to face, the decisions that we have to make. And this kind of wondering I translate into images. But these are not puzzles that have a kind of a right answer. I think the answer that an individual finds looking at my paintings is very much a response, an answer to his own questions.
I think that's very fair, Sam. The other part that I would just indicate as I'm looking at the painting, the rope that goes as I'm looking at it from left all the way down to the blue bottle is such a powerful movement, a powerful diagonal, that it really, even though it's a very thin line, it creates such power against all the verticals that are in the piece, that somehow the tension in that is transferred to all of the objects. And I always think back to the notion that still life in the 17th century used to represent what the society was that these still life objects came from. And in your still lifes, these are all objects that are somehow in disarray, some deteriorated, others certainly not the color we would expect. And so there is this sense of disorientation and upset that in spite of the calm that seems to be here, there's an enormous amount of tension and energy in this painting, at least on my screen, that certainly jumps out in a very profound and meaningful way.
Thank you. Thank you. You know that when a painter paints, he thinks mainly in terms of shapes and tensions and the architecture of the surface. And there is a desire to create formal answers and questions within the surface of the work itself. So if you notice, for instance, the diagonal goes from one corner of the canvas, and if you continue the line, it goes to the other corner. And this is like in the game of chess, the line of the knight, which is the most important line. So I will not bore the people who listen to me about the architecture of constructing a composition. But there is quite a lot of conscious skimming in terms of proportions, of straight lines, vertical lines versus inclined lines. There are some very slight inclinations and so on that try basically to catch the eye of the person that looks at the painting, first of all, as a shape and the color, and then only later goes into the reading of the meanings on condition that its eye was attracted to it. So the artist's work is a lot in attracting the eye of the beholder by his means.
And Sam, if I could add one quick follow-on question to Bernie's last comment.
Yeah.
You are very careful about the titles that you select for your work. Why is this not still life of two green birds?
Well, it depends to whom it belongs, the painting. Does it belong to one green bird? Is the other one a kind of a visiting guest? And so I don't know. I do not usually choose titles that define the painting too closely and too clearly. I try also in the title to remain open.
Mm.
I think the title certainly does that.
Yeah.
Jacqueline, I think we'll move on to the next painting only because the essay for the first painting was long and our conversation has also been long.
Okay, so let me set the stage for this this interpretation by Nadine Payn. And for those of you who have the physical catalog or the electronic catalog, it's found on page 26 for your reference. So notice again, as with the last, the sumptuous colors here, and a repetition of some tropes that appear constantly across Sam's work. The dice, for example, die becomes one. The question mark, Lady Justice's scales or pieces of the scale, rainbows, as Bernie mentioned, that evoke the Genesis series. And if you look in a certain way, you can see a certain shape of Hebrew letters, yods, for example, and Sam does that with English as well as Hebrew letters. Literally two birds face to face in an ongoing conversation. But what are they talking about, and to what end? And what does the title to the left signify? Titles are important, and they shape a response, as we saw in the last image, and they're an invitation. So what are we invited to overhear, to participate in the conversation? Nadine leads us into a conversation about these and other questions, and the way Sam's work invites her and us to ask about the past and the present. And so now Jeanne will read Nadine Payn's essay.
Samuel Bak is gifted with the astounding ability to conjure beauty from horror, to employ color, line, and texture, to create paintings with multiple meanings, and most of all, to pose challenging questions to us and to himself. Bak offers no easy answers. In encountering his art, we must maintain an attitude of both and rather than either or. To the left depicts two birds cowled from wood and metal scraps who are trapped inside giant dice with shell-cratered pips. Their beaks, which draw us into the painting's center, are mere inches apart. The left bird, lime green, is compressed by a vice-like die. Its aquamarine wood-grained wing curves gracefully but uselessly outside this prison. The red-orange bird inside the right die has a bit more leeway, suggested by shadow and a crutch-like leg. Its wing could also be a table representing destroyed domesticity and possibly a painter's workstand. Unlike the songbirds of Bak's maternal grandfather Hone, these birds cannot fly. They are reminiscent of the bird Sam and his pals fashioned piecemeal from rubbish in the Vilna ghetto. The boys pretended it could fly them to freedom while bombing Nazis on the way. Near the red-orange bird, a wooden pole pierces a fallen blue-green question mark that serves as a visual link to the green bird, but stops short at a gully. Its marble-like ball has rolled down the slope. It cannot function as a bridge. Rather, it compels us to ask questions. Is Bak's canvas about separation, impending death, chance, even hope? I conclude all of the above. The birds, surreal stand-ins for tormented humans, are an anxious conversation that might be a heartbreaking farewell, an excruciating acknowledgement of the powerlessness of each to rescue the other. I'm aware that Bak chooses his titles carefully. To the left implies selection, an SS man's casual wave towards life or death. My research and survivors' talks indicate that to the left in Auschwitz did not always mean the gas chamber. It depended on which year a victim arrived, on which ramp, on which version of a Mengele. While the birds appear doomed, Bak, with his dice imagery, presents the notion of chance. He loves wordplay, so note that the singular of dice is die. Perhaps our left bird will indeed die, and our right bird will live. Perhaps vice versa. Maybe neither will survive. Might both be liberated? Chance plays a terrifying role in who lives or dies in every catastrophe, including our COVID pandemic. In Bak's life, why was his pre-ghetto sidekick, Samek Epstein, dragged out of hiding and riddled with bullets, while he, Samek Bak, is alive at 87? Bak's poll raises further questions. Is it a cross, a sad grave marker, a signpost? The arrow-shaped crossbar points to the left and possible gassing. Yet its tip touches the far shore of a tranquil, misty mountain lake. Additionally, dark green leaves cluster on the canvas's upper right. Might there be hope after all, for these birds, for humankind, for our planet? Bak's questions and painterly skills mesmerize me. I cannot avert my gaze. Can you?
Thank you, Jeanne. So, Sam, the notion of using arrows as direction or misdirection certainly has been part of your vocabulary for many, many years. This particular one doesn't have any writing on it. But nonetheless, as you view the painting, it seems to be to the left. If you're in the painting, it may be to the right. So I just love the fact that there's constant sort of enigmas visually as well as in terms of what you're asking the viewer to engage.
Yes, I must say, obviously, the person that wrote the essay knows about me quite a lot, which I heard in the text. It is obviously very important when one looks at a painting, is simply to try to describe what one sees. And when one is searching for the words to describe what one sees, then a lot of things come up to the surface of the thought. And that is wonderful. That is when one starts really to see something. But there is something which is beyond that. It is to be well informed, and this requires another level of effort. I mean, I have now struggled the third reading of Crime and Punishment of Dostoevsky. And then I realized that although it is the third time that I read the book, in order to understand it a little better, I bought a book on Dostoevsky of 960 pages, which I am now reading to understand a little better what I read before. So now I'm just bringing this as an example of how incredibly endless is the route of understanding what goes between the I and thou, and of what all this is built. I don't know if I answered the question.
I think it's almost irrelevant because there's a constant question mark at the bottom of this painting.
Yeah, right.
You're more than welcome to keep answering. But I think what occurs to me as you're talking, and the next one, which we're not going to yet, is actually a painting that we talked about last week. But it's talked about in such a different way. It's exactly what you said. And I'm sure that when I look at it this week, it will be different than it was last week. The notion that somehow your paintings allow us to come to them where we're at the moment, and then come to them a second or a third or a fourth time, really opens up the possibility of continued enrichment, at the same time continuing questioning of the life that we are living, and whether or not this is relevant only to the pandemic, this moment. There's enough difficulty in our universe and enough to be questioned that the paintings always seem relevant. And for me, that's one of the gifts of your art.
Thank you.
Gary, do you have a thought?
Well, I guess I echo that. The bird to the right, the orange one, its beak is open, speaking or gasping. I think about both of those possibilities, and one can communicate, one can even speak by being silent. So it's entirely possible the silence of the bird on the left is that silence that speaks louder than any chirping could imagine. So I find constantly when I look at works like this and work, that what I first thought to be the case turns out also to be an inverse of another possibility. And how deliberate that is, whether that's a function of, in some cases, of the color contrast, or a function of the placement of the elements on the image, as we saw with the rope that extends outside of the frame. It seems to me you structure in an inevitable other reading that doesn't let you settle for one, not even yours. And I appreciate that a lot, because I wouldn't want to get into a debate with you about what your paintings mean. And I understand from all the ways in which I've heard you talk about them that that's not what you're about. You're about that question that lies at the foot of this image, that is pierced by some reality that we can't yet finally decide upon, but that we must somehow at a certain point. And I think the author, Nadine Payn, does when she raises the COVID-19 issue as a part of her experience.
Absolutely. I must say that most of my paintings, I would almost say all of my paintings, start to have a life of their own while I'm at work on them. So there are some things that are decided more by my subconscious needs of solving some problems or riddles that I find in the structure. When I started this specific painting, for instance, I thought of the two birds that face each other that are in the tradition of old ancient Jewish certificates of marriage, the ketubah. Usually they have illustrations of two birds, one in front of the other. It's an old thing for centuries. They have been doing these drawings. And then, so I was thinking of this couple, one facing the other. And then the element of luck. I'm not sure these were dice in the beginning when I started to work on that, but these were kind of rocks.
Yep.
And then the rocks started to transform themselves into gigantic stone dice, luck. This is also a very important element. These two birds can be one confronted with the other, but they need luck in order to make this marriage certificate last for a very long time. So there is, and even in the colors, this is certainly a painting that must have been in my studio up and down on my easel for a couple of years. So maybe it started with something blue that little by little disappeared and then it became orange. And so I want to say is that it is something very definite to hear what the painting then evokes for other people. And it is magical, it is amazing. I'm not even sure that one of them had an open beak and the other were closed. But since I had a certain shape that you can see on the far horizon, there is some land getting into the water. I needed an answer of the same form going in a different direction. I opened up a little the beak. So then when I looked at it, I kind of smiled to myself, but I think, oh yes, this is my wife who tells me, stop speaking when I speak. Let me finish. So you see all the things that participate in the creation of a work, and then I don't know, how these things happen, but they happen, and it is absolutely magical that then they go. And yes, when I say to the left, I obviously thought of to the left. It means somebody from above who is very powerful takes the decision, this is where you are going to go. And unfortunately, I thought then this is how we live in the world where things are decided, not everything by ourselves, but by some other powers, whether divine or simply Washingtonian.
And one of the nicest aspects of this brief discussion is to realize that you listen to your wife. So I think we should
I do. Not only do I listen, but she also obliged me to buy hearing aids.
So that's a long-term commitment.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next piece.
All right.
And, Gary and Jacqueline, please.
This next piece is by David Boocker, and it's to be found on page 11 of the catalog. And it's an image, as Bernie mentioned, we heard discussed 2 weeks ago, A Nest of One's Own. Notice the verticality of this composition. The lines draw your eyes upward to the sky, the heavens, and to a light that inundates a horizon, and to a bird with extended wings. Another thing to observe is excision, and this relates to images Sam has created across the Vilna and the Ghetto Boy series, that trees and buildings and ladders are cut off and separated from the ground. Objects of and life are suspended in the air. There's a suspense here, grave matters that defy gravity, perhaps. And what do we make of that? From one perspective, it may be post-catastrophic. And I think about having come from most recently from the Midwest, where tornadoes are a way of life, how all sorts of things end up pierced by trees. Is this the effect of that kind of natural storm? Or is this the effect of an unnatural storm, a scene of destruction that has been imposed by some force, malignant or not? Or thirdly, is this a scene of a form of reconstruction of life that's going on? And I think of, for example, the way a tree encases a foreign, even a deadly object like barbed wire. Have you ever seen a fence so close to barbed wire to a tree then grows around that and encompasses that threat inside its body, that it can't escape? Well, David Boocker draws our attention to some of these conundrums, particularly that of safety and escape, and how this painting invites us to consider it. And so, Jeanne.
Okay. In Ongoing Conversation, Birds and the Art of Samuel Bak, Jeanne Koles writes that through the myriad and often oppositional associations with the bird, Bak narrates a spectrum of experiences and emotions, ranging from annihilation and terror to survival and hope. Each work unfolds in a process of discovery, revealing itself to the close observer who recognizes that all is not what it seems. In A Nest of One's Own, a conventional bird's nest is presented in the form of a man-made treehouse. Bak's bluebird does not sit within the safe confines of its nest. Instead, a treehouse comprises the torso of the bird's body in a way that reveals that the bird cannot fit in its nest. This is not a nest for birds, but a treehouse built by and intended for humans. The nest, a place of safety and rebirth, is presented by Bak as a dilapidated treehouse that is neither accessible nor functional and is therefore unsafe. The meaning of the painting is grounded in contradiction. Whereas a nest is a symbol of life in symbiosis with nature, Bak's treehouse nest is broken and unable to provide a safe haven that can sustain life. The bluebird in Bak's painting, artificial in its two-dimensionality, appears to be in flight but cannot fly. While the bird's right wing is upright and gives the appearance of flapping, the metallic left wing is detached and has lost its blue color. It hangs by a string hooked over a nail drilled through the treehouse into the trunk of the tree and points down into a deep hole, perhaps a grave. In the center of the painting rests the nest or treehouse. A treehouse is not simply a place to which children can escape. Treehouses have been employed by humans as places to escape from danger, as practical instruments from keeping families safe, and as ways of living above inhospitable ground. An effective treehouse is built in deciduous trees, as is Bak's, but in order to survive, it has to be built in a healthy tree with a solid, intact root structure. Bak's treehouse is built atop a rootless tree, part of which is not even connected to the ground. Bak's tree appears dead, and its yellowing leaves drop off in the wind. It is not likely to be able to withstand wind, nor does it have a rigid platform. A ladder to access the treehouse emerges from a deep hole, but the ladder seems to have broken rungs and ultimately does not connect to the bottom of the treehouse. The black bird in the upper right corner is landing cautiously on a dead branch, as if recognizing that this is not a safe nest. Like many paintings in this series, A Nest of One's Own rewards careful observation. The painting offers an ideal of safety and survival in the form of a nest with a peaceful landscape in the background. But the broken image of the nest in the painting seems to tell us that this nest is no place to escape. It is not a safe haven for humans, or for that matter, birds. As such, it provides no liberation from the horrors of the Holocaust.
Thank you so much, Jeanne. So that
You're welcome.
presentation, and it's also nice that you were credited at the beginning of his remarks.
Quoting myself, yes.
Yes. And it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to do that. Sam, this is a very different way of looking at the painting than we did last week or 2 weeks ago. And in a sense, some of the things that you were saying before about how you approach it, this is clearly not a marriage contract that you're dealing with in this one. but it must have started with some visual idea, whether it's a tree or the tree house. And you have reference trees throughout, and Jewish tradition certainly does, with the description of the Torah itself as a tree of life.
Yes.
Can you comment a bit on that?
Well, you know, there is this process of free association of a tree house, of tree of life, and so on, that all of them kind of bubble in me when I create the painting. Now, since memory is not a kind of a downloading of a specific folder, but memory is a creative recreation of something. When I look at this painting, so many things in me come to the surface, and I do not know if they were the reason why I painted it, or if these are simply things that the painting evokes in me when I look at it now as a finished product. First of all, I must say I very much love the essay that David has written about the painting, and I absolutely fully agree with his view of it, which maybe also transcends what I intentionally put into it. Because you see, I think that every painting I paint is in some way a self-portrait. Every painting of me contains not the way I look, but the way I am. All the things that bubble in me when I am at work. And I must say that since the day that I was kicked out with my mother from our home in Vilna and sent to the ghetto, and until actually even now, I have never regained the sense that the feet on the ground on which I am are kind of on a very safe surface. I have always a sense that there is something temporary, that something that suddenly can move, there's something that can kick me out. And this makes me appreciate the day that I live even more, because I consider every day that I live in the place where I live as a miracle. But throughout my life, there were many places where I started to live with a sense of, okay, so that's where I'm going to be. For instance, when I came to Israel, it was quite obvious to me that this is where I'm going to be. It was not to happen. When I settled in Italy, I thought, well, this is where I will have one day to ask my children to find a rabbi to bury me, because it's not so very simple in Italy where there's a very small Jewish community. But with time, I realized there is no such thing. And maybe this kind of very precarious and yet absolutely wonderful way in which I can exist and do the thing that I love doing, which is painting paintings. All this, I think, is, I hope, expressed in the very bright colors and a lot of light which is in this painting.
I was reminded of the fact that when we did the exhibit at the Snit Gallery or Snite Gallery at the Notre Dame University, that the director got up and had counted that you had lived in 18 different places. So the notion of having your roots planted anywhere is certainly understandable when you say that you're not sure when you plant your feet where you are.
Yeah.
But so that notion of being movable in a very, very specific sense. And then the whole idea of a nest representing both security and safety, the treehouse that Dave has referred to, certainly makes this painting another autobiography. We're going to move on only because I realize that the paintings are incredibly rich and we're spending too much time. Gary?
Okay, so I mean, we'll turn to.
We had some more questions, so I can read them at the end as well.
Okay, please do.
Okay, so we'll begin. We'll pick up with Still Still and Erica Brown's contribution. So this is a different still life from what we saw with Still Life of a Green Bird, the very first image that we began to discuss. More conventional in some ways, less surrealist perhaps. Focus seems to be more domestic as opposed to a mixture of the natural and the domestic, as in Still Life of a Green Bird. Notice the bright, dark, contrasting corners that suggest, and I think Sam's already mentioned this, a certain tension in the work, and that the fruit, which is a feature of many of his images, for me evokes all kinds of hungers. On the one hand, hunger could be it could relate to your hunger for food. It could relate to your hunger for safety. It could relate to your hunger for continuity. What kind of hunger might that we be clued into here? If you move, if you read by moving your eye horizontally from left to right, the bird dominates, and the bird's eye is the one that that captures my attention. But what happens if you read right to left? And there's no guideline here that says you cannot do that. And you start with the eyelet of the tag that is attached to the bird as if it were some sort of flea market object rather than something you would have at home on your table. How different the reading becomes when the imagination is set free by the different motion here of a still scene. Erica's reading offers such an imaginative reading by using other imaginative readings, namely the rabbi's response to that very sensuous text, the Song of Songs. And like the Song of Songs, Sam's paintings touch some of our deepest human aspirations and experiences. And so we turn now to Erica's essay.
In Samuel Bak's 2019 Oil on Linen Still Still, body parts of the dove enwrap the shapely pear, creating the image of fruit about to be liberated from a still life. The painting challenges the eye with a calm sense of irony and whimsy. After all, if a piece of fruit were to fly away, the painting could no longer be called a still life. Unlike many of Bak's paintings where birds are trapped, their wings wood, tin, or stone, or painfully stuck in the crux of a tree, this painting suggests that even inanimate objects can, with the assist of string and two wings, take flight. The combination of fruit and wings also harkens to an ancient garden filled with fruit and doves, the love nest in the Song of Songs. Flora and fauna mirror and amplify the love. Doves appear in almost every chapter. Behold, you are fair, my darling, behold, you are fair, with your dove-like eyes, and you are beautiful, my beloved, handsome indeed. Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 15-16. The reciprocated compliment that begins with dove-like eyes was so striking in the song that the Talmudic sages regarded it as the mutual adoration of God and the Israelites. In all other songs, either he praises them or they praises him. Here he praises them and they praises him. Behold, you are fair, my darling, with your dove-like eyes. And they praise him. And you are beautiful, my beloved, handsome indeed. Song of Songs, Rabbah 1, verse 1. In the dove verses that follow, it is the dove's eyes rather than its wings that are its main attraction. Ah, you are fair, my darling. Ah, you are fair. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. Chapter 4, verse 1. The beloved's eyes may be covered in a diaphanous veil, but the lover can still see them, like the penetrating blackness of the dove's eyes and the sensuous invitation they offer. Chapter 5 intensifies the bird's stare, its shining dark pupil. His eyes are like doves by watercourses, bathed in milk, set by a brimming pool. Chapter 5, verse 12. The dove of the Song of Songs also paradoxically symbolizes both fidelity, only one is my dove, my perfect one, chapter 6, verse 9, and remoteness. In chapter 2, the lovers are separate and seek each other's faces, aware that the bird's eye is at once close and very far away. O my dove, in the cranny of the rock, hidden by the cliff, let me see your face. Let me hear your voice, for your voice is sweet and your face is comely. Chapter 2, verse 14. While the pair in Still Still may create the illusion of flight, we, the onlooker, know that the bird in Bak's painting will never fly. One of its wings lies lifeless on the table, reminding us of a verse in another song, this time a modern one, Leonard Cohen's Anthem. The holy dove, she will be caught again, bought and sold and bought again. The dove is never free.
Sam, my guess is that this is probably one of the furthest interpretations from anything that we have ever experienced outside of an essay by a professor at a Catholic university in the Philippines who decided to view your work in the context of Zen Buddhism and made you a Zen master. So between being a lover in the Song of Songs and the Zen master, how do you feel about both of those?
I'm absolutely fascinated. I'm fascinated and I'm grateful for somebody who brings so much creativity into the vision of my work. And this is exactly my intention, is somehow to trigger a way of thinking and a way of creating one's own poetry. It's absolutely wonderful, but I look at my painting as if it was painted maybe by somebody else. I always try to look at my paintings as if they were painted by somebody else, because then I start really to see it. When I look at my paintings as done by me, paintings for which I am responsible, I hardly ever see a painting without thinking, this little item should have been more to the left, or this color should be more orange or more blue or whatever. I love this text. What can I say? It's for me very enriching, but it certainly gives me an idea for another painting.
Yeah. I would love that, as they say. Gary, do you have a brief note? And we need to go to the next one. I realize that we're a little short.
You want to pick up? You want to pick up?
Or if you have something else to add about this one or not, we can certainly. I just, one part of this painting that there are two parts actually: the shipping tag, or the tag that you indicated, and then the wing with the stripes of either the prisoner's garment or the prayer shawl, the talits. Keep me somehow connected to the Shoah, to the Holocaust, to refugees going from one place to another and having their baggage tagged, and then the garments that they either wore to pray or to be imprisoned. So in spite of the very beautiful reference to the Song of Songs, there are many realities going on in this same piece. So rather than going on with it, why don't we go on to the last piece, and then we'll have time for the questions and some of the responses.
Surely. This last one takes up a painting that was discussed again 2 weeks ago, ongoing conversations, and so finally we turn to one that is most appropriate for what this conversation is about. Exemplifies what it means to engage Sam's work and the questions, concerns, hopes, and stories it evokes. After all, Sam, you're a great storyteller, and the telling of the story is not to be separated from the painting itself, it seems, as is the case with the viewer, whose stories are not separate from their experience of the visual. With this painting, the vertical force of the composition again directs our eyes upward. Yellow saturates the canvas and sets off broken objects of home life in a fairly stark way. Notice how, again, back to this theme of excision, items of everyday life are suspended. Chair, the table, the teapot, the rock facing itself. A sense, once again, of suspense dominates, maybe haunts. And if everything pauses, as if the painting is, it's as if everything is paused, so waiting for viewers to respond with their stories. And so Laura Mandel does. She relates a story of her experience that continues the conversation with Sam's work and with life and the power of art more broadly to evoke something personal, historical, and finally familial. So Jeanne, you can begin.
Okay. The scene in Bak's ongoing conversation, 2019, feels strangely mundane and simple, despite being completely surreal and absurd. The normalcy of pouring tea at a kitchen table, juxtaposed by the fact that the objects in the scene not only float, but intersect through one another. The painting initially caught my eye because of the wonderfully playful Alice in Wonderland vibe, as if the Mad Hatter left his tea party floating unattended in space. Like the mouse and the Mad Hatter, the teapot and the bird feel like characters in this story, just waiting for their guests to arrive. And while not alive, the bright white teapot mid-pour has merged with the tree to bring a feeling of life and hope to the painting. Contrasted by the black of the bird perched just above, we're reminded of those lives lost in the Holocaust, whom Bak so prolifically paints through a diverse visual lexicon. Beyond the surreal intrigue of the painting, I realized that I was drawn into this painting because it tells my story. When I think of my great-grandmother, I think of the photo of her sitting at her kitchen table in Nuremberg, Germany, similar to the table in this painting. Before my grandmother left her mother on the last boat out of Nazi Germany in 1939, Nuremberg was home to a thriving, educated, and heavily assimilated Jewish community, much like the life I now lead in Brookline. When I look at this painting, I see my own ongoing conversation across generations and time, the similarities in our lives and how that informs who I am. And while I can't speak to my ancestors directly, I'm reminded that there is an ongoing conversation in my DNA and in my memories. If you are less familiar with Bak's work, you might simply see a stone-like background in the painting. But if you reference other Bak works, the Jewish star in the background will pop out like a magic eye picture. Looking at this yellow star in the background, ironically obscured by its huge presence, it also hits me viscerally that my great-grandmother was forced to wear the yellow star to mark herself as a Jew. Almost 100 years later, I have reclaimed this star as I bring Jewish public art to Boston, proclaiming our tradition loudly and proudly. Bak is not only a master of surrealism and storytelling. Through his masterful layouts and imagery, he enables us each to see our own story in his pieces. This is the power of art.
We're coming up to the end of the hour, and the nice thing is that we paid so we can stay a little bit longer. So I wanted you to be able to respond to that because it's a totally different conversation than we had about the painting 2 weeks ago. Please.
Well, you know, as I told you before, every time I look at a painting of mine, I look at it a little differently. Right now, because of the text to which I was listening, I somehow remembered myself arriving with my mother to the ghetto, where we were among the first wave of people that were sent in there. And we saw at one of the gates of the houses near the entrance, Nissan, who was a man who worked with my grandmother. And he said, come up. In this building here lives my daughter and her family. And we went up the staircase and we entered a place where there were no living beings, but there was a table with all kinds of unfinished food, a turned over bottle, maybe a tea can. I remember there was a table in a state of a total disarray. And somehow right now, when I was listening to the text of the essay on this specific painting, maybe because of the star of the yellow star, which is so evident in this painting, of course, and which is one that I was wearing on my little coat when we entered the ghetto. This specific image kind of popped up in me, but At the same time, there is this growing tree, the tree that brings with it this kind of very kind teapot that is just there to pour in something into the half-hidden cup. I think that I have brought in here also an element of survival. And there is the philosopher of this painting is the bird that sits on this chair on which a human will not dare to sit down, and thinks about it. I don't think I can add more to that.
I'm so grateful for that, Sam, because I think that each of the paintings now, for me looking at this 2 weeks after we looked at it before, reinforces the wonderful title for the entire collection, which is an ongoing conversation, whether it is an internal one that we have with ourselves or with those around us. So I just want to summarize and thank everyone for being here. Apologies to some of the questions, Jacqueline, but let me just say that this is both a summation and a continuation, and our thanks to all of you who participated. We also want to announce an upcoming body of work that will be published as an e-catalog. It's something that Sam has encouraged some time ago, and the theme is, and Jacqueline will show just a few of them, the theme is hammer and nails. And the e-catalog will include some of the images, this being one, opening up, along with an essay and shared conversation between Sam and Jeanne Koles again. And that should be available, I would guess, by late August. The paintings are already done and available. One other point, thank you so much. You can just leave that up. That's, I think, it says it all in so many ways. And so hopefully this is the beginning of not a single conversation, but an ongoing conversation that all who participated will engage in. One of the fantasies that came about this past week with Gary was the notion of possibly creating small Bak chat rooms that once a month the gallery would send out to these individual initiatives, 2 or 3 images, and have the people participate and share their understanding, interpretation, and reactions to those works. So we'll see if it works. Technology is certainly part of what we've called reimagining the gallery. But I just wanted to thank all of you for being here and being part of this. What comes to mind on a consistent basis is a quote from Brother Thomas, which is essentially, consciousness of the beautiful will save the world. And we all hope so. So thank you very much for joining us, Sam, Jeanne,
Pleasure.
Gary, Jacqueline. Thank you, everyone, Sam especially, for sharing once
Thank you
again
all so very much.
this
Thank you.
enormous richness that is always yours. And it's always a surprise just to hear you share again and again things that I've not heard after 50 years. Thank you.
Must keep something aside for the oncoming 50.
Okay. Alibi, as they say in French.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone. Jacqueline, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.